All right, we're going to get started here. Walter L. Hixson, since 2019, serves as a columnist and recent contributing editor to the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs. His books on international relations are quite extensive. He's the author of the book American Foreign Relations, A New Diplomatic History by Routledge in 2015, American Settler Colonialism, A History, 2013, Palgrave Macmillan, and The Myth of American Diplomacy, National Identity and U.S. Foreign Policy from Yale University Press in 2008. So his discussion today is focused entirely on the new book, Imperialism and War, The History Americans Need to Own. And he's going to tell you what that title means and all about the key points of this book. Walter?
Okay, thank you, Grant. Welcome, everyone. I'm just going to give a little talk on American history today, not the American history that's familiar to most Americans. For starters, we won't begin in 1776. That's way too late to undertake a discussion of American history. In recent years, there's been an emphasis on 1619 as a more appropriate starting date, when the first African or Afro-Caribbean slaves were introduced into North America. But actually that's too late. So you really, as the people of this district might well understand, need to go back to 1492 and to Columbus. After landing, Columbus made the observation that the Arawak Indians he encountered knew not modern implements like the sword that one of them cut themselves on, and would make good servants. And this is where we need to begin with the imperial history of the United States, going all the way back to 1492. So 1619 won't work because there was slavery before African slavery. And American historians have done a really good job, actually, of chronicling the history of Indian slavery, particularly in the Southeast, but actually through across the entire continent. Indigenous people were enslaved, and there were massive, very violent slave wars in which Indians were confronted with a stark choice of either enslaving other indigenous bands or being slaves themselves for the plantations that evolved in, particularly again in the Southeast, but actually all through the Mississippi Valley and really even in the Northwest. So Indian slavery is one of the most understudied and emphasized aspects, but very important to understand really the foundation of future American foreign policy. So I'm going to do a panoramic discussion of all of American history, quote unquote American history, extending to centuries before the United States was even created, formally in 1776 declared, and then the Constitution following a decade later. So in order to understand the history of imperialism and war and the extent to which they're inculcated into American identity, you need to factor in these centuries of enslavement of indigenous people as well as African Americans, centuries, the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, into the 1800s. So that's more American history than the period since formal independence. So in order to understand U.S. history, you really need to go back in time and consider the longue durée, the broad scope of so-called American history. Now, after 1776, well, let's talk about a couple of things before that. A couple of, I think, revealing vignettes. So I want to talk about Bacon's Rebellion. in 1676, so 100 years before the American Revolution, in colonial Virginia, Nathaniel Bacon. This is a well-known incident in American history, but it's really full of meaning for understanding the United States, for understanding American identity, for understanding imperial history. So it's not unknown, but it bears emphasis. So Bacon was a late arrival in colonial Virginia, and there had been actually very violent Indian wars since the founding of Jamestown in the early 1600s. There was also cooperation, there was intermarriage, but the way events played out, the modernist Europeans believed themselves superior to the heathen savages they encountered, and a violent conflict erupted anywhere that Europeans arrived. Eventually, some very violent conflict in Massachusetts as well as Virginia. So there had been Indian wars in Virginia, and the governor wanted a respite from this conflict. But Bacon wanted land. He had risked his life crossing the ocean because he wanted opportunity for land that he didn't have in England, where he was not the first son. And so under primogeniture, the first son inherited all of Dad's wealth. So for him, the opportunity to come to America was alluring. And when he got here, he found that all of the good land, the readily available land in Virginia, was taken by planters and already established. He wanted his own, but the governor drew a line and said, don't go out into Indian country. We don't want Indian conflict at this time. And Bacon and a band of followers, former indentured servants, so white slavery ultimately doesn't work in America. And Indian slavery actually doesn't work either. African slavery eventually works because primarily Africans had immunities from European diseases that Indians didn't have, and they died in droves, 80 to 90%. In any case, in 1676, Bacon defied the governor. He and his band of followers went into Indian country, attacked, cleansed the land of the Indians in order to take it for themselves. This is very foundational in American history. The governor called out the militia. Bacon's band actually defeated the militia and drove the governor into the harbor aboard ship, burned Jamestown to the ground. Bacon suddenly died, probably of dysentery, and the reinforcements came and it fizzled out. Catapult almost a century in the future to 1763. This is really the beginning of the American Revolution. Kids are taught in school that Americans oppose taxation without representation, like on the Washington, D.C. license plates today. But really the spur for the colonial-wide revolt, which brought these very disparate colonies. Virginia had almost nothing in common with Massachusetts, for example, or New Hampshire, and yet they all came together in a revolt. What really kick-started it was 1763, the Royal Proclamation, where much like Bacon's rebellion, the British Crown drew a line atop the Appalachian Mountains and said to the settlers, don't cross this line. And we don't want Indian conflict. There'd just been the French and Indian War. We wanted a respite from conflict with indigenous people. Once again, the settlers defied the government. Defying the government is American as apple pie. All we have to do is follow today's news to see how deeply ensconced it is. And so what I'm suggesting is this goes way back into American history, the anti-authority and also the imperial violence that these settlers wanted to carry out in order to get land, to take it from putatively inferior, savage people. So there's this long history of Indian conflict, of Indian removal, of ethnic cleansing, of American imperialism. It's foundational in American history and goes more extensively back than American history itself. But after the Revolution, after the creation of the United States, again, this imperial violence is rooted in American identity. The American Revolution was an inspiring event. It really did inspire people, helped bring on the French Revolution, a more sweeping social revolution about a decade later. And it gave life to a powerful discourse. And this discourse goes to the heart of American identity and has been extremely influential, pivotal in American history ever since. And that discourse is, of course, that America is the land of the free. It's a beacon of liberty. It's a land of liberty. It, in the post-World War II period, is the leader of the free world. So this is a powerful discourse that emanates from the American Revolution. But that's what it is. It's a discourse. It's language. It's words with very powerful meaning. And what it's done is has elided or overwhelmed this deeper imperial history that I'm talking about that is very deeply rooted in American history, American in quotes, since 1492. So this discourse that America is a chosen people, an empire of liberty, destined to lead the world, the last best hope of mankind, all of this is a powerful and even hegemonic discourse that Americans that has formulated a powerful American identity. What I'm suggesting is that there's a dark side to this identity. It has enabled imperial violence and a continuous pattern of imperial violence that's rooted in the subjugation of indigenous people, in centuries of that and centuries of African slavery. This is racialized imperial violence, rooted in American identity, but often overlooked because of this powerful discourse that is loosely known as American exceptionalism, American chosenness, the idea that the United States is the land of liberty, land of the free. So, continuing our little panoramic romp through American history, through imperial history, let's jump to 1830, Indian Removal Act. The U.S. Congress legislates ethnic cleansing of the Southeast. It legislates the removal of thousands of Indians these were bands that had done more than others to acculturate. They learned English, many were Christian, some owned slaves, talking about the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Seminole, the Chickasaw, and which one am I forgetting? I'll think of it in a minute. The so-called 5 civilized tribes. And they used that moniker, that they were civilized tribes. And yet, the people of the Southeast wanted that land for themselves. And they justified this removal under a popular national chauvinist president, Andrew Jackson, as the triumph of superior over savage people. And so a sweeping legislated ethnic cleansing, the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Just a decade and a half later, the United States precipitated war with Mexico. Much like war in Iraq in 2003, and these are the kind of continuities I see in American history, the president mendaciously depicted the situation, declared that Mexico had attacked on American soil, complete falsehood. He actually sent troops down into disputed territory south of the Rio Grande to provoke war with Mexico, which inevitably followed. And the desire was not merely Texas, which had previously established its own Lone Star Republic and broken from Mexico, but actually the real goal was to take California. And that set up the United States as a Pacific imperial power. So what the so-called Mexican War underscores is this imperial violence that I emphasize in this book, Imperialism and War, the History Americans Need to Own. So the United States sought and provoked war with Mexico in order to take the Southwest, a massive territory, all of Colorado, Utah, California, Arizona, Nevada, the whole sweeping area. Previously, of course, Jefferson had bought a massive chunk of the continent with the Louisiana Purchase. The United States would later buy Alaska. So think about this. This slaveholding nation is essentially buying the homes that are already lived in by other people. it's purchasing land, and ethnic cleansing is bound to follow because the people who live on it will be subjected to racist discourse as inferior savages, as pre-modern people who don't deserve to keep the land. So actually just buying people's homes and later driving them out. There were tremendous contradictions in American history, and of course they led to the tumult of the Civil War, and still the most violent conflict in all of American history, when Americans killed 750,000 of each other in recent years. Using census data, historians have increased the death toll. It used to be estimated at 620. It's now estimated at 750,000. So a massive bloodletting. It took a couple of decades after that to recover, but this is another theme. One way Americans get back on the same page and unite is imperial violence against a demonized other. And in 1898, the United States waged the so-called Spanish-American War. And I say so-called because if we were really to be accurate about it, it would be called the Spanish, Cuban, American, Filipino, Guamian, Hawaiian War. And you can throw in Wake Island, which the United States had previously bought, or Midway as well. So this is a tremendous expansion across the Pacific. And the major front in this war, which was fought in Cuba and Puerto Rico, which the United States took as colonies. Cuba was not formally annexed. Puerto Rico was and remains a colony to this day. But the main conflict was fought in the Philippine Archipelago. And I've always, in teaching this over the years, found that Americans know very little about the Philippine conflict within the Spanish-American War, and it's highly consequential. Just the death toll alone, and so this is another theme of the book, is the indiscriminate warfare waged by the United States very often in its history. And I don't argue that the United States is a uniquely evil or even uniquely violent nation. There's plenty of that in plenty of imperial history in global history. But I do think it's important to unpack American history and to separate it from the mythology of exceptionalism, of the chosen nation narrative, of the innocence that's sort of implied in America as the land of the free that masses of citizens grow up with. So in this Philippine conflict, as many as 800,000 Filipinos died. It's a pretty appalling death toll. The estimates vary. Maybe it was only 300,000. Nobody really knows. And Americans didn't much care. And that's another theme in this book. While we are highly neuralgic, sensitive about the deaths of Americans in conflict, which is understandable, Americans frequently pay little attention to the deaths of others. There's actually a good book by John Tierman of that title, The Deaths of Others. The Philippine conflict, they weren't all killed by any means, not even most of them directly in conflict, in war. Many died from disease, most died from disease, but they were put into concentration camps. So this is the first, but not the last, guerrilla war that the United States would fight in Asia. A big debate erupted in 1898. A group called the Anti-Imperialist League was formed in Boston and protested. People like Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie, former President Grover Cleveland, and they said, this isn't right. This isn't what America represents. We don't take colonies. We're not an imperialist power. And Theodore Roosevelt, among others, responded, yes, we are. This is no new departure, as he put it. If we're going to give back the Philippines and Puerto Rico, we should give back Apaches, Arizona back to the Apaches. This is not a new break in our history. This is what we've been doing. And I think Roosevelt was right. This is an imperial history, a continuous imperial history, and the anti-imperialists wanted to view 1898 as anomalous, but actually it reflected continuity in American history. The anti-imperialists lost the debate. The United States incorporated these territories, became a Pacific power, and I argue that anti-imperialists nearly always lose the debate in America. This hegemonic chosen nation narrative anchors a triumphalist, manifest destiny, as it was called in the Mexican War period. It's our manifest destiny to take these lands. We are the land of the free. We're the chosen nation. We're the leader of the free world. It's okay when we do it. The United States broke precedent established by George Washington, intervened in World War I, and this was left Americans actually very unhappy. Even though the Allies won World War I, the Great War as it was called. They didn't know there would be a World War II at the time, of course, so it was called the Great War. The Allies won, but Americans were embittered. Their president, Woodrow Wilson, was a brilliant, articulate spokesman of this idea of American chosenness, destiny, and leadership of the free world. He said that we needed to fight the war to make the world safe for democracy, and that America would lead. In fact, he did lead and anchored the Paris Peace Conference, which ultimately was rejected at home, and the League of Nations rejected an idea that would come back after World War II that Wilson had tried to establish at the end of World War I. He had all sorts of contradictions. He didn't really mean to make the world safe for democracy. He meant to make the Western white world safe for democracy, because he was a segregationist from the American South and did not think Latin Americans or Asians were suitable for democracy. He really meant the Western world. But in any case, also during the war, Americans introduced the draft, which was very unpopular. People didn't think that it was appropriate for the government to take their sons and force them to fight a European war far from American shores. The draft was unpopular. Women and African Americans were angry. Safe for democracy. We don't have the vote. We're segregated. What democracy? So there was a lot of protest, and in fact, the war helped bring women's suffrage finally to approval in that conflict. Civil liberties were repressed. This is another theme. Civil liberties were repressed throughout American history in wartime, and America has usually been at war. You don't find many years when the United States was not at war. There's a long history of militarism and warfare that I chronicle in this book. So amid that, you can take as a general rule of thumb, war creates hostility to civil liberties. You're not supposed to criticize the nation when it's at war with foreign enemies. And in World War I, socialists, recent immigrants, critics of the war, like even Eugene Debs, socialist who'd run for president and got 6% of the vote in 1912, he was jailed. So the Alien and Sedition Acts brought unprecedented curbs on free speech. In your lifetimes, our lifetimes more recently, we've had the Patriot Act and very similar assaults on privacy. If they want, the national security state can read your mail, read my mail, if they think we're a threat to security. So wartime, and America's been at war very often, brings hostility to civil liberties. That's another theme that I deal with. All right, carrying on, the Depression, New Deal, there's stepped up involvement in trying to ameliorate conditions of domestic life, which had been, the United States had been an amazingly dynamic country. It had been a magnet for white European immigrants, built a powerful economic machine in the late 19th century, anchored by the railroad. The system collapsed, however, in 1929. And a popular president, the only one ever to be elected 4 times, and that'll never happen again unless the Constitution is changed again, Franklin Roosevelt sought relief, reform, and recovery in the New Deal. The New Deal didn't solve the Great Depression, but it did bring some relief and some recovery, and it increased the role of the state in domestic economic affairs and created a rudimentary welfare state, Social Security, and things like that. Which takes us to Pearl Harbor. This is another war that, in some respects, far more than people realize, the United States chose. So you might think, what are you talking about? Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. This is true. Japan did bomb Pearl Harbor, and that did ignite the war. But in fact, and apropos of contemporary foreign policy discourse pertaining to China, the United States made China central to its national security, a term that was created in the World War I period but really took off in the post-World War II period. That is, Japan had invaded China as well as Southeast Asia. And the United States, there's another myth that I unpack in this book, that the United States has often been isolationist. It's a myth. The United States has always been an imperial power, first continentally, later globally. If it had truly been isolationist in 1930s and early 1940s, it wouldn't have been involved in World War II. But the United States declared that Japan's intervention and invasion of China and Southeast Asia was unacceptable. The United States also wanted, and even more so, wanted to contain just an egregious, fanatical Nazi regime which was attempting to dominate Europe. So Pearl Harbor provided the opportunity to mobilize public opinion and get in the war. So all I'm saying is that had the United States actually been isolationist and indifferent to Japan's aggression in Asia, Japan wouldn't have felt encircled and launched the Pearl Harbor attack, and history might have been different. But we deal with history the way it happened. But it's important to note that World War II wasn't this bolt from the blue that people think is associated with Pearl Harbor. There was a long lead up and a lot of effort to contain Japan, and they knew that it could lead to war, which it ultimately did. All right, this is an absolute turning point in American history, the Second World War, because out of it the United States comes unscathed. It's the dominant superpower in the world, its economy, its dollar. Washington and New York are the centers of the political and economic world. The United States is more powerful than any country had ever been in all of global history. It has an Air Force second to none, a Navy second to none, and a victory on both fronts, an ebullient public, and it's the global superpower. The UN is established in New York, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund are established in Washington. The dollar is supreme. It's unprecedented global power and influence. However, that power was projected into what became known as the Cold War. And for the next several decades, the United States waged a global effort to, quote unquote, contain communism. Actually, what the United States sought to do was to undermine and destroy communism. Communism was anathema to American principles of capitalism and electoral democracy, and it waged a Cold War on every front. I mean, there's literally no place in the world that the United States is not dedicated to containing communism. So this anchors a continuous imperial and militant history that I deal with in the book. The United States wages wars, first, of course, Korea, established military alliance NATO, eventually would fight in Indochina, in a devastating conflict in Vietnam, as well as Laos and Cambodia. All of this is in the name of containing communism, which is depicted as a demon enemy out to control the globe. And so there's massive U.S. intervention against dark-skinned people all over the globe, with indiscriminate warfare, masses of people killed, and often, as in Korea and Vietnam, Korea an inconclusive outcome, and Vietnam an outright defeat of the United States. Meanwhile, what the Army general and World War II hero Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex was created and fueled an obsession with high defense budgets, massive militarization, of course, starting with the atomic bomb, any new military technology that could be devised would be funded. So another theme of post-war American history, this just happened last week. The Congress routinely approves massive Pentagon budgets. Last week, they gave the Pentagon more than it asked for. Meanwhile, an infrastructure bill, or gosh knows, anything that has to do with domestic welfare will be brutally and hotly contested. So this is another powerful theme that I discuss in the book. The United States has increasingly, as an imperial power, abandoned, really forgotten how to deal with domestic affairs and domestic crises. And this is where we are today. So I'll take 5 or 10 minutes and wrap up, and if you all have any questions or online audience questions, we can get those. Let's jump to 9/11. So September 11 is this another, to many people, bolt from the blue in American history. That people, as George Bush naively and incredibly simplistically said, they hate our freedoms. That's why this happened. There's a long build-up to September 11th, 2001. And it flowed from the United States supporting reactionary regimes in the Islamic world, and it flowed from the special relationship with Israel, in which the United States funded very generously the Zionist state, even as it invaded Arab territories and illegally occupied them in defiance of the UN and the global community. Votes in the UN on the illegal Zionist settlement of Palestine, you can look up the history of those. They're like 120-4, with the United States and Israel, and throw in a couple of Marshall Islands, voting in Israel's behalf. So it's a blatant disrespect for Palestinians and for and perceived, particularly with the by Islamic radicalism, as an attack on the Islamic religion and tradition. So all of that created the blowback that was sensationally brought home to Americans in 9/11. So blowback, the CIA term for the consequences to be paid for past imperial actions that are resented by other people and eventually blow back on the homeland. We became a homeland after September 11th. Nobody referred to America as a homeland before that. So it blew back sensationally with these horrific attacks in New York and Washington and Pennsylvania in 9/11. So thereafter, of course, the U.S. Invaded Afghanistan, but didn't stay or round up the architect of 9/11 on the first go-round. He would hang around another 10 years to menace the Americans. But the neocons, of course, famously decided to propel a war in Iraq because it was available, and oil, of course, is a factor. But this is imperial hubris that I trace throughout American history. It's a disaster, as we all know now. The Iraq War is appropriately known, called by one scholar a fiasco, or one journalistic account entitled Fiasco. It was a fiasco. A couple years later, 2005, New Orleans, Hurricane Katrina. The Bush administration, the U.S. government, utterly inept response. Its inability to even conceive of a domestic crisis and apply resources intelligently to handle a domestic crisis really underscores the extent to which this militarized national security warfare state, obsessed with global intervention and imperialism, can't handle a domestic crisis. It's utterly mishandled to the detriment of the residents there. Let's jump to today. We have a global pandemic. It's been handled dreadfully. Of course, the United States elected an essentially a white nationalist demagogue president in 2016. No need to go into all the detail on that. Trump's an extreme version of the imperial chauvinism that is inherent in American identity. And the problem with his extreme version is he gives license to the same sort of people who engaged in Bacon's Rebellion or the Proclamation line, who defied the government, didn't care what the government said, had their own plans, and would not follow any directives. So this has been unleashed at this point. We have a global pandemic. We're still operating in the nation-state paradigm. There are calls for containing China, for challenging Russia over Ukraine, for going to war with Iran. Israel would like to bring the United States into a war with Iran. Israel would love a war with Iran and the United States to go in on that. Israel, of course, unilaterally developed nuclear weapons. It's the only country in the Middle East that has them, but it can't brook the notion of an Iranian nuclear program, which the Obama administration had addressed with an effective treaty, highly verifiable, but of course Trump torpedoed that. So I think where we are today, to conclude, is that we're caught up in the imperial paradigm. And the metastasizing national security state since World War II, military-industrial complex, whatever sort of cliche you want to use, we're a militarized imperial power. We're still looking at state-to-state conflict, China, Russia, Iran. Will there be a next war? If we stay in this paradigm, history would suggest to you there will be. What I think Katrina, and of course the tidal wave that's coming of climate change, which was long denied by fools defying science just as fools defy the science of the pandemic, we're going to willy-nilly, whether we like it or not, have to adopt a new paradigm. We're going to have a transition much like the one that came in World War II, where you open up a whole new way of doing business, of thinking, of conceptualizing, of dealing with the world. What I call for in the end of this book is an approach of cooperative internationalism. If you want real national security, or you need international security, because guess what? Yes, it's a cliche. It's also very true. It's a global village. It's all interconnected. The idea that nation states can pursue their own national interests and that's going to make the world safe and stable is nonsense. It's an interconnected globe. The United States must work for cooperative internationalism, disease control, address climate change, address migration, address human trafficking, address weapons sales and the militarization of the planet, address the destruction of animal and plant species. This is the foreign policy of the future. We need a profound transformation. We need a new paradigm. We need a new foreign policy. We need to transcend this foreign policy of imperialism and war. Thank you. I'll entertain questions. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
What do you believe needs to change about mainstream media that you could argue fuels imperialism and, use of buzzwords like you would say, like national security? And what would that look like in, let's say, the shift in paradigm shift?
Yeah, it's.
Can you repeat the question?
Yes. The question is, what needs to change in the mainstream media? And this is a big problem and a big impediment. I mean, the mainstream media is caught up in the hegemonic discourse. So, any subject you want to take up, foreign policy. So the mainstream media, what do I mean by that? New York Times, Washington Post, let alone, Fox News or right-wing media, they're going to operate with, assumptions. For example, that China is a dangerous country, a repressive country that needs to be contained. I'm not saying there's not, there aren't problems with China. I'm not here to say China's a great progressive country doing everything right. I'm fully aware. I spent 5 months teaching in Beijing at the China Foreign Affairs University. There's all sorts of problematic aspects of Chinese behavior. But, I've talked some about the special relationship with Israel. You're not going to read critical accounts in the New York Times of the $3.8 billion the United States sends annually to Israel, which is a small country of 9 million people and already the most militarized in the Middle East. So the problem is, as your question suggested, the mainstream media operates within the discourse, within the hegemonic discourse, which is inclined to view the United States as, the land of the free, that is progressive, is trying to make the world more safe and democratic. Actually, throughout the history of this book, there are more examples of the United States bolstering authoritarian regimes, such as the Israeli apartheid regime, such as Egypt, such as Saudi Arabia, some of the Eastern European countries that are authoritarian but might be helpful in containing Russia. So all those assumptions, as your question suggests, are within the mainstream media. You've got the internet where anything goes, but the problem is that a lot of people lack this, not to sound, arrogant and elitist, but it's too confusing for too many people to sort through, to understand. So you have critical voices through the media, through the internet, less than the mainstream, more so than the mainstream media, but it's difficult to access them or to know what to think about them. So I think it's going to take this paradigm shift I'm talking about, and I think it's going to have to be, a very rocky road to that paradigm shift. It's going to have to be brought on by events. So we're not going to be able to say, hey, mainstream media, why don't you think more critically and operate outside the discourse and not be so inclined to demonize other countries or to propel this mythology of American exceptionalism. I don't think it's going to work that way. I think it's going to, when this tidal wave of climate change keeps hitting us and other contradictions and blowback, it's going to force changes, as I say, willy-nilly. So unfortunately, I don't have a very good answer to your question. I don't have an easy remedy for how to change the media, which is very problematic.
So a couple questions. One was, you were throwing around the term savage a few times when you first started, and was that tongue-in-cheek or reflecting the terms back in their epic, or why use that term? And then the second one was, what percentage of Americans would you estimate actually do know about and own this sort of history?
Mm-hmm. Well, let me make clear that savage certainly isn't my term. It's since Columbus, this basic dyad between civilization and savagery has prevailed in propelling this imperial and militant history. So many of the things I talked about, whether it's Bacon's Rebellion, Indian Removal Act, Manifest Destiny, these have been justified as the inevitable modernist triumph of a more civilized people over a savage, backward people. Obviously, it's demonizes the racial other. These are demonizing dark-skinned people as being less capable. Actually, some of the indigenous, as I mentioned with the 5 civilized tribes, they adopted that term in order to undermine this dichotomy between civilization and savagery. They're saying, no, we're civilized Indians. Why are you removing us? We speak English. We have nice, you can take a tour of the Southeast of some of these beautiful homes and farms that indigenous people, particularly the Cherokee, had. They had their own newspaper. They hired lawyers and very aggressively fought in the Civil War. I'm sorry, Grant, what was the second part of that question?
Yeah, the second part of the question was, do you believe, what percentage of Americans do you believe actually do know about and own the sort of history that you're writing about? That
gives me an opportunity to really emphasize this theme I didn't emphasize enough, that is throughout the book. I did mention it, but I want to really emphasize it. There's no left in the United States. The left was essentially liquidated. Maybe that's a little stark to say there's none. It's certainly attempting to revive. I would consider Bernie Sanders on the left. And he, more than anyone, anchors what constitutes the left in this country. And I think it is growing. There was a left in the 1930s. There was even a legal communist party that actually did more for race relations and anti-poverty than anyone else was doing in the United States. But one of the most important aspects of the Cold War is the liquidation of the left. And with so-called McCarthyism and the emphasis on national security, anti-communism. I mean, this is a provocative book that I've put imperialism in the title pertaining to American history. Well, you can't do that. Communists use the term imperialism. It's illegitimate. So we don't think about ourselves as an imperial power. I argue we certainly are and have been. So one of the big problems is that there's not a viable left. Doesn't mean that the left has all the answers necessarily, or we should all be leftists. But what in Western Europe, the left takes discourse further left, then you have a center, which is where our politics begins. Liberals are centrists and goes to the right. So without that left, you have an imbalanced, and so the most obvious example is national health care. To Western Europeans, this is like, yeah, this makes sense. Let's, if we're going to have any government at all, let's give people, basic health care. But this is, of course, brutal debate for decades in the United States. And it's, godless communism when Obama introduces medical care. So the lack of a left means that we don't have enough people who are willing to unpack the discourse to answer that question.
So we have another question here about language and whether modern day equivalents to the term savage include Hillary Clinton referring to deplorables or Trump referring to people with good genes.
A general term that is useful is demonization of the other. So this is an enabling discourse. When you demonize the other as savage or deplorable or whatever term you want to use, it's easier to mobilize people to kill them and or contain them or marginalize them at best. So language is very important. It should hopefully come through with this talk. We're overgrown apes that created language to communicate, but language doesn't convey truth. Language, these are words, and the power associated with how those words are framed and used is where the rubber meets the road. So, but if people take language at face value, deplorables, savages, what have you, and then act accordingly, what must be done is the language has to be interrogated, unpacked. You have to address the meaning that's being applied to the language and how that works in relation to power. So I do think that there is some relevance to the question that the viewer asked about more modern invocations of demonizing discourse.
Excellent. So just for the purposes of the stream, this book is available in Kindle, Audible, hardcover, and paperback formats. And if you're not here and able to receive a complimentary copy, even signed by the author, you can certainly buy them at Amazon.com, Middle East Books and More, and other fine purveyors of books. So thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, sure.
What do you think about the socialism of the Civilized?
Say it again.
I don't know how to say it in English word. The socialist
Socialist.
of the Siglo 21.
Siglo means century 21.
Okay, century 21.
And what is that referring to? What movement? Is it a domestic movement?
Not necessarily. What happened is it has been the photo of São Paulo where they practice and do a lot about this. The socialists of the century 21.
In Brazil?
It started in Brazil.
Mm-hmm.
It has Venezuela, Nicaragua,
Yeah.
going Going to Peru.
Yeah, well, I think it's a progressive development. I think it's anti-imperial. Who's the Brazilian president who was jailed? Lula. You know, speaking of language and demonization, Chavez of Venezuela was demonized and dismissed as a reckless, communistic, anti-democratic. Actually, he was elected and reelected repeatedly. He was popular with a large segment of the population because he fed people and provided health care and was not a racist, who did not reflect just light-skinned Latin American elites, but cared about indigenous people, mixed-blooded people who were often left out of the mix in that country. So anyway, yeah, Nicaragua, I think that to the extent we didn't really talk about the whole Monroe Doctrine legacy of the United States, this is a huge part of American imperial history, that the idea that the United States had the right to dominate all of Latin America and supervise it. That has carried on to today, but Venezuela is a good example. The United States tried to anoint a new president, just declare this man's the new president. It's not working. So to the extent they're able to defy that, and I'm not saying again that the left necessarily has all the answers. I'm not, I swear, don't tell the FBI that I'm a card-carrying communist. But we need that mix into the discussion. I think it does have a lot to offer in terms of anti-poverty, healthcare. There's a lot of progressive elements to this. So I think to the extent they defy the dominant Washington-centered, and I didn't talk much about the neoliberal global economic domination sponsored by the United States, but this country, the U.S., is a plutocracy. This is a government of the rich for the rich. And, that's not what I believe in. And so to the extent people are articulating the idea of more inclusiveness and providing basic necessities to people, I'm gung-ho. What do you think of it?
Well, seems to me that they are going too far. I agree that things should be more equal and all that, but lately they have been abusing power.
Yeah. Well, I think part of the problem is that I think that it has Venezuela under Maduro, for example. I'm not really an expert on it, but I think it has become more repressive. But they're having to combat the most powerful country in the world, doing everything they can to, destabilize and unseat them. And so I support them in that. But I understand your point. I don't say they have all the right answers. So, thank you.
Thanks, everybody. We're going to have to wrap. We have another event. Thank you for coming, and be sure to pick up your book.
Sir, would you like your book signed?